Hi, my name is Benjamin Williams. I'm the senior minister for the Central Church of Christ in Ada, Oklahoma. And this lesson is prepared for a summer series at the Crosstown Church of Christ. It's unfortunate that circumstances make it where I can't be with you personally, but I'm glad to be able to participate with you in this way and hope that it's a benefit to you. Your summer series has involved some character studies in New Testament figures especially, and my assignment is Pontius Pilate, the agnostic ruler. And what I'd like to do is take the little section from John's Gospel. We could look at a couple others, but I'm going to focus on John's Gospel primarily and look at the scene where Pilate and the high priest and Jesus interact together. And Pilate reveals a lot about himself by the questions that he asks. And what I think we can do, if you'll kind of permit me a little liberty here, we can use the story of Pilate as sort of a parable to discuss what we think about knowledge and what does it mean to be agnostic. I think a lot of our culture today was probably best described as agnostic. Agnostic comes from Greek terminology, the root meaning not knowing. Basically, in the world of theology, you have a theist who says, I believe there is a God, an atheist who says there is no God, and an agnostic who says either I don't know or I don't believe I can know, some variation of that. They're not claiming knowledge in either case. In fact, they may be claiming that that knowledge can't be obtained. But really, the idea of agnosticism goes further than that, further than just the discussion of whether or not there is a God. Pilate, for example, the debate isn't about whether or not there is a God, it's about the identity of Jesus. And I think that's a really good parallel to the culture we live in, which largely simply is agnostic towards the identity and purpose and nature of Jesus Christ. There is some anti-Christian fervor out there that exists, and there is some genuine Christian faith out there that exists. But by and large, most people just prefer to be somewhere in between. Jesus might be an all right guy, and maybe it's nice to hear about him once in a while if he says something I want to hear. But by and large, people, I think, are just not terribly interested in the question of who is Jesus and why does that matter. In essence, they've become agnostic towards Christian belief, agnostic towards the person of Jesus. And so what I want to do is just take the story of Pilate and talk about it in terms of how he approaches knowledge and how similar it is to what we see in our culture. Knowledge is a tricky thing. I'm a guy doing some research in philosophy right now. I'm very interested in philosophy, especially a field called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and of knowing things. And we have to be careful with knowledge because it's a little bit slippery. On the one hand, I believe there is such a thing called knowledge, right? That there are things that I can know. And that sounds like a fairly simple claim, but you might be surprised how slippery that is to get a hold of. Because on the one hand, you have people that claim you can't know anything. Like that all knowledge is ultimately ephemeral, that it's all just kind of wispy out there and you really can't know anything for certain. Certainly nothing about Jesus. But then there's another crowd that says their knowledge is certain knowledge. And in fact, all the knowledge they have is held in certainty, that everything they believe is an absolute. And so you kind of see the extremes of that. You've got, I can't know anything and I know everything on either side. And what a Christian wants to claim is actually more modest, that there is a thing called knowledge. I don't know everything, but there are some things I can know, and I can know that reasonably, and I'm not irrational for believing those things. And it's really the agnostic point of view that no, you can't know anything that I want to talk about today. I just mentioned the other extreme because it's prevalent as well. So without further introduction, let's take a look at the agnosticism of Pilate, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who tries Jesus Christ. And we'll start in John, the 18th chapter, verses 29 through 30. This is after the priests have come to Pilate with Jesus. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him to you." So usually we focus on kind of the quirky, evasive answer given by the Pharisees, or rather the high priest. I don't know if the Pharisees are involved, but the high priest there, that, hey, if he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him, which is just, a silly answer. But the first thing I'd point out is that Pilate's question is a pragmatic approach to knowledge, which isn't all bad. Pilate has a job to do, okay? And we need to understand Pilate's job. Pilate is a Roman governor in a foreign land under Roman control. He has one job. Let's stretch it. He has two jobs. Job one, no rebellions against Rome. Job two, make sure the taxes keep coming in. That's it. If he can accomplish those two jobs, he is a successful governor. And so as a person trying to do his job well, he asks the one question that matters. Why are you here? Why is this guy here? What's he done? In his role of peacekeeper in the situation there, his job is to find out if Jesus of Nazareth is guilty of anything, and then to deal out justice, because without justice, we have riots and revolution. We got to have it. I only mention that question because it is a pragmatic question, and it's going to, if you start there, it gets away from you a bit. His question isn't, is Jesus a good man? His question isn't, I want the facts and I want all the facts. What he wants to know is what he has to know to do his job. He wants to know the bare minimum. Here again, the question, what accusation do you bring against this man? I need the legal precedent for this discussion we're about to enter into. Again, from a legal point of view, nothing wrong with that question. If you're going to have a trial, you start with an accusation. But it just, as part of our little parable here, that we're going to read Pilate and ask, what does he think about knowledge and how does he know things? He starts out very pragmatically. We can fall into that little trap too. It's not a bad one, but it can be, where we only want to know what's required to get along and do things, right? That if I can live my life and it can appear successful without knowing anything about Jesus, then maybe I don't need to know it. See what I mean? That it becomes very pragmatic. And I think that's what you see is that in our culture, there's a pragmatic approach to knowledge, that we want to know enough to be successful at our job, to do whatever things we have to do, to make good decisions in a practical sense. But we probably don't spend a lot of time sitting around thinking about the big questions of life. What matters? What is real? What is true? What does God mean for my life? And what is the purpose of my life? And who am I? We probably don't ask those questions because it's easier to ask, how do I work my microwave? What do I have to know to get on with life? And that can lead to some dangerous places. So he's given the answer, hey, if he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him to you. So he's guilty, which is shady. Pilate responds, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Verse 31. And to which the Jews say to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, which again is technically correct. They ignore that from time to time, but under Roman law, the death penalty, capital offenses, were reserved for the Roman governor and the government. But I'm interested again in Pilate's response. Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. What's he trying to do there? We might call that the evasive approach to knowledge. There is a man accused of a crime. Pilate knows that much. He's either innocent or guilty, which means he should either be punished or he should be defended and vindicated. Pilate would prefer to do neither. We might also call this the lazy approach to knowledge. That, does this have to be my problem? Wouldn't it just be better if you dealt with this yourself? I don't want to get involved. Now, what's wrong with that? Maybe we shouldn't be busybodies who gets into everybody's business. That's true. But folks, there are right and wrongs in the world. And we're not allowed to take a pass on them. Pilate does. With his kind of agnostic approach, he says, I just don't want to know. It's a moral choice. It's not just saying I can't know the answer if he's guilty or not. He's just saying, I'd really rather not know. I'd rather you guys take care of it and I'll stay out of it, and that'll be the end of the story. And I think a lot of us take that approach to Jesus. What do you think about Jesus? Is this my problem? I'm not really religious. Well, it might be. If Jesus is who he says he is, yeah, it is your problem. It does matter for your life. It's a big deal. So making a decision on that is not something we can be neutral about, but Pilate would really like to. He'd like to be evasive. So verse 33 through 34, Pilate entered his quarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Here again, I love this little exchange because in legal terms, Jesus is sitting squarely on his rights he doesn't have to self-incriminate. He's not, even whether it's Jewish law, Roman law, American law, you don't have to self-incriminate. You don't have to say, oh, you're right, I am guilty, you should arrest me, right? That's not how this is supposed to work. But Pilate says, are you a king? But I'm more interested right now in Pilate's question. Are you the king of the Jews? It's a very direct question. You can almost feel again Pilate's disinterest. He only has the two jobs, collect taxes and put down rebellions. If Jesus says, yes, I am the king of the Jews, well then clearly he's a threat to Roman authority, and Pilate's job is to execute him, to put down this potential rebellion. It's really simple. And so what is Pilate asking? We might call this the minimalist approach to knowledge. He wants to know what he has to know and nothing more. He's not asking a really deep probing question, hey, tell me about yourself. He's not asking, here's some witnesses and here's some information I have, what would you say to that? He's just going to point blank ask, give me your plea, guilty or not guilty. And what's even funny, he's kind of setting Jesus up. I mean, you look at Jesus, he doesn't really look like a king. He's setting Jesus up to walk free. All Jesus has to do is say, well, I'm not that kind of king. I'm not the kind of king you're looking for. I don't have an army. I'm not here to invade your capital in that sense. I'm not a threat to Roman authority in the way you think I am. As it turns out, Jesus is a threat to Roman authority. He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he's going to overthrow the world. But, whatever. For now, in the militaristic sense, he is no threat to Rome. Are you King of the Jews? And so what Pilate's doing is simply saying, okay, there's apparently something I have to know to do my job again. Part of that pragmatism, that evasiveness. Just tell me the least I have to know to be able to get on with my business. And Jesus actually won't even give him that. He says, who told you? Where are the witnesses? I don't have to incriminate myself. 35 and 36. Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest had delivered you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. Notice again, and I can't emphasize this enough, how often Pilate engages the situation through questions. What's going on here? Why don't you try him? Are you the king of the Jews? And now we might think of this as a psychological question or a motivation question. How did we get here? Because Jesus was evasive about the direct question, are you king of the Jews? Now Pilate asks a more psychological question. He says, look, I'm not Jewish. And you can again see he's kind of testing us about, he doesn't want to be involved in this debate. He doesn't want to be here. And so he says, I'm not Jewish. Your own people brought you over here. And he asked this great question, what'd you do? But he doesn't ask it, if you look at him, really with the intent of learning some crime Jesus has done. He's simply asking, what's the motivation here? You got to think about this from Pilate's point of view. Pilate is the Roman governor, and he's here to keep the Jewish people quiet. On a normal day, Pilate would hear a rumor about some rebel leader, somewhere out in the country raising an army, and he'd have to track them down, and he'd send his troops from house to house saying, hey, where is Kokbar the rebel? Where is so-and-so? Where are these guys? Where's Kosiba? Where is he? Tell me where he is and we'll go arrest him. And of course people would say, well, we're not telling you anything. We're not going to tell the feds. And they never would give up, their own people. And so the Romans would have to track them down and find and put down these rebellions. Except on this occasion, the people who hate Pilate the most show up with a Jewish rebel gift wrapped and say, here he is. You should probably put him to death. So Pilate, obviously his suspicion is alerted. He's not a dumb guy. He's agnostic, but he's not dumb. And so he looks at the situation and realizes there is some kind of hidden motivation here. And now he's curious about that. Again, I never get the impression in any of this that he's actually interested in the innocence or guilt of Jesus or whether Jesus is who he says he is. He's just trying to understand what's happening. What do I have to know to do my job? How can I keep this quiet? And for crying out loud, how come you're here in the first place? Why did your people bring you to me? At which point, Jesus gives his most direct answer, or one of two direct answers in this entire exchange. Most of the time, Jesus is standing on his, what we might call his right to remain silent. He doesn't have to condemn himself. But in two places, he gives just a brutally honest candid answer to Pilate. Here's one of them. My kingdom is not of this world. It's actually an answer to two questions now. First, are you king of the Jews? Well, we're getting to it. I do have a kingdom, but it's not the kind you're looking for. You're looking for a rebellion. You're looking for armed soldiers in the woods getting ready to, guerrilla warfare attack the Roman sentries. That's not what I'm doing. My kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my troops would be outside fighting. Do you see any troops, Pilate? No. But he's also answering the more direct question, what have you done? And the answer is, well, my kingdom's not of this world. What is the only crime Jesus is really guilty of? He gave the people and the leadership a kingdom they did not want. He brought to them the kingdom of heaven rather than another kingdom of earth, and they weren't having it. If he had brought them the kingdom they wanted, he'd be their king right now. Instead, he brought them something different, and instead he's on trial. I'm not Jewish. What have you done? My kingdom's not of this world. So Pilate then is going to drill down on that, having moved past the motivation. Okay, it seems like something strange is going on. I'm trying to get to understand this a little bit. What have you done? What's going on? What's the politics of this? And then he asks Jesus, so are you a king? You see his insistence, his persistence there. The first question, are you king of the Jews? Next, a political, psychological question. How do we end up here? What's going on? And then third, back to the original question, so are you the king? Because that's all Pilate needs to know. See the problem? Pilate only wants to know exactly what he needs to know to do his job. He doesn't need to know if Jesus is the Son of God. He doesn't need to know if he is working miracles in the countryside. He doesn't even know or need to know if Jesus is a good man or not. All he needs to know, are you a king? If you say yes, I have to crucify you. And then Jesus does something really wild, which is to say yes, right? So the first time, what have you done? Jesus gives the answer, my kingdom's not of this world. I don't have an army outside. I'm not a military threat to Rome. But then Pilate says, so are you a king? And I think Pilate at this moment is just waiting for a no. Jesus says, no, I'm not a king. And he can go out and say, hey, this guy's not a king. I'm done with him. And instead, Jesus says this, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Like, if you're Jesus' attorney right now, you're so angry, because all he has to do is say, not guilty. I'm not leading a rebellion against Rome. Except Jesus is a person, as he says, who bears witness to the truth. Jesus isn't a person who only gives you the truth he has to say, who says the minimum amount of information necessary. Jesus isn't a person who's going to evade the truth or be pragmatic about the truth. He's a person who's going to give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Are you a king? You bet. I was born to be a king. I'm your king. And that's why we're here. That's the truth. To which Pilate gives his now very famous answer. It's another question. What is truth? At this point, you kind of feel the tension in Pilate and the frustration just kind of come unhinged. We don't know exactly what Pilate meant by that. Does Pilate mean there's a game afoot and I don't know what it is? What's the truth here? Is he asking something philosophical? Is there such a thing as truth? I don't know. But what you get out of that question is that Pilate's really no longer interested in the question of truth. He asks that question, what is truth? And then he walks away. He's not asking, Jesus, would you tell me what truth is? I'm very curious. He's just fed up with the game. He knows something's going on that he doesn't quite understand, and he doesn't really want to know what it is. He'll ask a question or two, but that's about it. Instead, he's going to go back to doing his job because he doesn't need to know if Jesus is the Son of God. He doesn't need to know if Jesus is a good man. He just needs to know what to do with him right now to do his job. He has an agnostic approach to this knowledge, or here we might even call it an evasive approach. A willingness to get as little information as he possibly can. And it's strange then to me, well, it's not strange, it's beautiful, that Jesus finds that moment to unload truth on him. Like, you want truth? Here's the biggest possible truth. Yeah, I'm a king. I was born to be a king. In John 18:38 and following, after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you Jesus, or the King of the Jews? That's how he says it. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Several things going on there that we're going to call the cowardly approach to knowledge. Another kind of element of being an agnostic is, I just don't want to put out the moral effort and the courage it would take to sort this out. He says, I find no guilt. That's not the same as saying innocent. He's not going to put his neck out there and say this man's innocent. He just says, I don't find any guilt. Now, you know how courtroom drama works. When the judge says not guilty, what happens? Somebody goes free. That's the end of the discussion. But not here. Pilate, ultimately, when it comes to truth and to knowledge, is a coward. He finds no guilt, but he's not actually going to treat Jesus as an innocent man. Instead, even though he finds no guilt, he's going to equate Jesus to a kind of robber. He's going to play games. He's going to make a wager. In other words, I'm betting, instead of making a conviction statement, instead of saying, I know for a fact this man's innocent, I know there's politics afoot here, I know what you're up to, instead of doing the thing that he should be doing with the knowledge he has, what does he do? He says, well, hey, let's try this. I'm going to bet that you're fairly decent folk. Here's a man that you know is actually a decent fellow, and you just don't like him. And then here's Barabbas, who is a murderer and a thief, and exactly the kind of guy that Pilate is supposed to convict. He says, tell me which one to release. And they surprise him and say, give us Barabbas. And at that point, again, Pilate, with any kind of moral courage at all, any intellectual courage at all, would say, that's just not right. That's not how this works, and I can't allow it. But of course, that's not how the story goes. Let's read a little more from John 19 and see how it does go. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God. When he heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his quarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave no answer. So Pilate said to him, Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to be crucified. We might call this the desperate approach to knowledge. Because at this moment in chapter 19, what becomes obvious is that Pilate has recognized something grave. After trying really hard not to know, he now knows and doesn't want to be responsible for it. He knows Jesus is innocent. How do I know that? He says it 3 times. He proclaims his innocence. But he doesn't want the burden of that knowledge. If he knows Jesus is innocent, he has to treat him like an innocent man. if he knows he is perhaps the Son of God. He has a responsibility beneath heaven that is greater than to Rome or the high priest, either one. And he just doesn't want that knowledge. So he keeps saying it. I find no fault, I find no fault, I find no fault. He's innocent. Do you really want me to kill him? Do you really want me to kill him? But he keeps abdicating his role as the judge. He says, I don't want it. I don't want to have to make a decision about Jesus. And so in the end, in his desperation, he has knowledge he doesn't want. And he gives over his choice and his moral responsibility to other people who turn out to be murderers. That doesn't make him innocent. That makes him a murderer. So the tragedy of Pilate is not that he never knew or he didn't believe in truth. It's simply this: some truths may not be known. Some truths may be known. Some truths must be known. And the identity of Christ is one of those must-be-known categories. And it's not an inert truth that you hear and you listen to and say, that's nice. This shirt is blue. But if you email me tomorrow and say, hey, I thought it was kind of purple, I'm going to say, okay, I don't care. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, is not that kind of truth. It's the kind of truth that once you know it, you can't unknow it, and you have to do something about it. And chapter 19 is an example of a man trying desperately not to know what he knows, and trying desperately to put the responsibility of that knowledge on somebody else. Well, here's the bad news. You know. It's good news too. We call it the gospel. It's good to know. It's the best thing you can possibly know. But here's what would make it bad. If you're determined in your life not to know about Jesus, not to consider the questions of life, who am I? Who is he? Who is God? Why are we here? If you just don't want to know that, it's going to be really hard to get away from that knowledge. At some point, agnosticism stops being an intellectual exercise and starts being a moral exercise, where you're deciding, I just don't want the responsibility of that knowledge. But you don't have that choice. You know it. Instead, what I would say is that John gives us, the narrator of this gospel, gives us an example of what faithful knowledge looks like. John 19:32-35, the priest said, hey, the holy day is the next day. We need these guys off the cross. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true. He knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. What did John just say there? He says, I'm not Pontius Pilate. I was there, I saw what I saw, and I know what I know. John was also there when Jesus rose from the dead 3 days later, and he would say the same thing. I saw what I saw, and I know what I know. And now the responsibility is on you. That's how he ends it. That you may believe. It's not a choice you can evade. It's not a choice about knowledge or the limitations of knowledge. It's about morality. What are you going to do with the knowledge you have? The determination to remain agnostic, to put Jesus in the really doesn't matter category, is Pilate's choice. And it results in the death of an innocent man. You don't have to make that choice. Know who Jesus is, accept that knowledge, and then act on it the way an honest person does.